started, everybody, because we're right at 4 o'clock. So thank you, everyone, for joining us on Zoom and on Facebook. We always start with our land acknowledgement. Crow Canyon Archaeological Center acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, Paiute, Dene, and Jicarilla Apache people on whose traditional homelands our campus sits. Our mission-related work is not possible at all without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future, and we respectfully recognize and honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all humankind. We are grateful to all Indigenous people, and we support the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. And that's not just an acknowledgement for us of where we are. This is what we do here at Crow Canyon. So thank you to all of our partners. I know everybody's familiar with Zoom, but don't forget to pop your questions in the Q&A at any time so that we will get to them. Especially with this group, there might be quite a bit of chatting in the chat, and we don't want to miss your questions. We're live streaming on Facebook if Zoom starts to give you some difficulty. And you can come back and watch this and our other webinars again and again on our YouTube channel. So we are going into a big week next week with our 40th anniversary conference. So there will not be a webinar a week from today. We will all be running around like crazy little marmots on campus, and hopefully some of you will be with us. But the week after that I'm really looking forward to. Taylor does such an amazing job finding the most incredible speakers. We have Jim Christophic talking about Medicine Women, the story of the first Native American nursing school. So definitely after next week, come and tune in. So I just want to give a shout out to everybody who was at our annual meeting last week. We had our annual meeting webinar. We actually had quite a lot of people coming. If you missed it, it is on YouTube. Taylor's going to put the address for the YouTube link to our annual meeting and to our other YouTube webinars. It's pretty fun. I mean, normally I would say, you know, if you're going to watch something, maybe the annual meeting isn't the most exciting thing to watch, but it is this time. Because we had the conference coming up over the last couple of months, all of our departments made these incredible video updates. Some of them are really fun. Some of them are kind of silly. Some of our people majored in drama and they're skit-like. So I definitely recommend going and checking it out. The 40th anniversary conference is next week on campus. We are full for registrations, unfortunately, but I think we're going to see a lot of people and it's going to be crazy. So this is about the time of year. We're in the fourth quarter where we start to get a little bit anxious in a good way about meeting our funding goals. And so I wanted to throw out there, if you didn't know, if you watch the annual meeting, you'll see more about how we run the organization, but we are funded almost entirely through charitable giving. So it's all of you watching who are keeping us going and allowing us to do the webinar series and all of our other programs. So if you're wondering how you can help, you can share events with your friends so that maybe we get some more folks engaged with Crow Canyon. You can leave us some positive reviews on Facebook or anywhere else that you engage with us, and you can donate to our annual fund. And I think if you click on the link that Taylor is going to put in the chat, there's lots of places where you can designate your gift if you want to. No gift is too small. We mean that. So please, we are so grateful to all of you, and we couldn't do it without you. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers today. This is, we've been devoting the first webinar of every month to Crow Canyon related research and scholars, and Kari and Shanna are well, we miss them. Our Crow Canyon scholars and friends and still associates. And I want to tell you a little bit about them. Shanna Diederichs is a fourth-generation Coloradan raised and shaped by the landscapes and history of the West. She works as an archaeologist and architectural conservator at Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants in Cortez, Colorado. And she supervised the Basketmaker Communities Project, which is just outside. You just don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
For Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, she has her MA from Northern Arizona University and a broad background in research, site conservation, and public education, and she aims to help people appreciate and imagine the cultural landscapes of the past, which she does astonishingly. Thank you, Shanna. Dr. Kari Schleher is the curator of archaeology at the Maxwell Museum and an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. Before joining the Maxwell Museum, she was our archaeological lab manager at Crow Canyon, and she worked on our campus. She worked with students and volunteers and staff to better understand ancestral Pueblo and material culture from all of our research projects. She worked on the Basketmaker Communities Project, as well as on the Goodman Point Pueblo and Northern Chaco Outliers projects. And she is especially interested in what we can learn about communities in the past by studying pottery making and design. And if you look closely, there are sherds behind her on that counter in her office.
True.
Thank you both for coming back to talk about this incredible project.
Thank you so much, Liz. We're really excited about this, and we're really appreciative of the offer to come and talk about this research. So today, Shanna and I are going to talk. Oh, I need to share my screen. Hi, sorry, I'm going to start. Today, Shanna and I are going to talk about the first and only major research project that Crow Canyon Archaeological Center has conducted on the Basketmaker III period. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, archaeologists call the period from around 500 to 750 AD the Basketmaker III period. This period represents the first time in Pueblo history when we can see archaeologically a number of elements of life that we characterize as Pueblo, including living in settled villages, making pottery, and a reliance on corn agriculture. So today we focus on the archaeological field and lab results of the Basketmaker Communities Project, but we also want to let viewers know that the project was done in conjunction with Crow Canyon's Native American Advisory Group, who participated in the development of the archaeological research questions we asked for this project, and also contributed to the results and deeper understanding about this early period of Pueblo history. So from 2011 to 2017, Crow Canyon conducted the Basketmaker Communities Project, or BCP, a multifaceted investigation of Basketmaker III period sites on Indian Camp Ranch, a 1,200-acre private residential development in Southwest Colorado. Crow Canyon spent 7 years investigating the Indian Camp Ranch settlement because it represents one of the most extensive and best preserved Basketmaker III settlements in the central Mesa Verde region. And today we explore how the social structure of the Indian Camp Ranch community shifted over time, transitioning from a small, diverse group focused on integrative ritual to a dispersed community economically and ritually dominated by a few wealthy lineages or family groups. We believe that this is the result of increasing integration and management in this rapidly growing community. These changes are reflected in increasing conformity of settlement patterns and in ceramic production. Shanna's going to first take you through to talk about population history, settlement patterns, and architecture, and then she'll hand it back to me to talk about pottery, my favorite thing. Take it away, Shanna.
Okay, thank you so much, Kari. And Liz and everybody, I'm just really tickled to be here today and just to have the opportunity to talk about the Basketmaker Communities Project. Kari and I both spent, almost a decade working on the project, and it's really exciting to have it included in the Crow Canyon 40th celebration volume and just share it with all of you. So what you're looking at is a map of the 107 Basketmaker III period sites on Indian Camp Ranch. Now, the history of this settlement is important because it's the glimpse into the first colonization of this part of the central Mesa Verde region by Ancestral Pueblo farmers. Prior to Basketmaker III, this region was generally occupied by hunters, gatherers, maybe a little bit of cultivation, but nothing like this wave of farmers. So with the Basketmaker Communities Project, we were able to track the founding of and the demographic changes and shifts in this settlement over time. We used all sorts of methods to investigate the settlement. And that included excavating pit houses, features, midden at 13 different sites. And all of the artifacts and samples from those excavations went back to the Crow Canyon lab for analysis and dating. We also used remote sensing. And you can see an electrical resistivity image of a pit structure in the center panel there. And then we did detailed tallies of surface pottery at all of those Basketmaker III sites. So we combined both excavation and non-invasive archaeological techniques. So based on our dating methods, we discerned that Ancestral Pueblo farmers utilized this area during 3 different phases, basically an early, a middle, and a late Basketmaker III phase. But to actually reconstruct the settlement of the history of the settlement, we really needed population estimates for each of these phases. So we used habitation pit houses as an indicator of households to get at that population estimate. At Indian Camp Ranch, we located 110 Basketmaker III pit houses. And we estimated that each of these pit houses represented an extended family, a household of basically 7 people, and that each pit house was lived in for about 20 years. So these estimates, those kinds of estimates come from cross-cultural studies of similar subsistence farming populations, and they have been generated by people like Mark Varian and have been used in other Crow Canyon research projects. So when graphed out, the population growth in this settlement across the Basketmaker III period is really surprising. As you can see, we basically had no households attributed to that early Basketmaker III phase. And yes, we did find that there was evidence of people coming through during that time. We had a couple small storage features, some hearth features, but basically people weren't living there. They hadn't actually settled there. These people were moving through, and maybe they were even new migrants into the central Mesa Verde region. They may have been testing the agricultural potential of different locations before they actually chose one to settle on. So Indian Camp Ranch was actually settled in the mid-Basketmaker III phase, and we estimated about 28 people were living in this study area at any given time. The momentary population increased dramatically in the late Basketmaker III phase to 153 people at any given moment. So what you're seeing is the founding and the growth of a brand new settlement in a new frontier, in an absolutely new farming frontier. So as I mentioned, homesteading of the study area began in earnest during that mid-Basketmaker III phase. Households were concentrated on one particular site, the Diederichs site, which is highlighted in blue on the map. But a few lone hamlets were also established in the surrounding area. So the Diederichs site is unique. It is the largest site we recorded on Indian Camp Ranch, and it also is one of the earliest sites settled. So the occupants lived in 2 pit house clusters, kind of one to the north and one to the south, and they built a great kiva in between them. Population rose after this between the middle and late Basketmaker III phases, and it grew with an implied growth rate of about 8% per year. That growth rate far exceeds any natural birth rate. And what I mean by that is that the initial population could never have had enough babies to account for that population growth, which indicates that new migrants were continuously moving into the settlement, both during the middle and late Basketmaker III phases. So one of our major research questions was, did this fast growing settlement see itself as a community rather than just a scatter of independent households? And the presence of the Great Kiva at the Diederichs site is the most compelling evidence that we have that they conceived of themselves as a community. Remember, the Great Kiva was built by the first settlers at the Diederichs site in the mid-Basketmaker III phase, and it was kept in use after that for almost a century. When first constructed, the Great Kiva would have been able to hold the entire population of Indian Camp Ranch. But by the end of the settlement in the late Basketmaker III phase, only about a third of the population would have been able to enter the kiva at any given time. So nevertheless, some segment of the community was continuously remodeling that Great Kiva. We found 3 different floor surfaces, and they participated in regular gatherings inside that structure, again, for almost a century. And there's evidence that community scale feasting took place inside and around the Great Kiva during those remodeling events and during the structure's final closure. So we have evidence that the growing Indian Camp Ranch population behaved as a community for a century. But where did these migrants come from? And really, we've written a lot about this, but the short answer is everywhere. Basically, we found that the Indian Camp Ranch population was really culturally diverse. I'm going to give you one quick example here of that diversity, and that's architecturally. Basketmaker III pit house construction styles have been proven to be learned techniques rooted in specific communities of practice. Kari's going to discuss that concept of communities of practice further in a minute, but just suffice it to say right now that we found 2 different pit house styles in the settlement. There's an Eastern style pit house that has bench supported roofs, and that's on the left there. And that is the style we expected to find. It basically demonstrates that the Indian Camp Ranch community was part of a shared central Mesa Verde and northern Chusca mountain architectural tradition. However, a few pit houses at the Diederichs site were built in a vertical Hakal wall style. And that developed to the west, sort of in southeast Utah and northeast Arizona. This type of architecture is really rare in southwest Colorado. The presence of these pit houses implies that at least some of that Indian Camp Ranch population migrated from the Chinle Valley of Arizona or the canyons of southeast Utah. So the Great Kiva itself is also a sign that the settlement's founding population had a strong connection to the Mogollon culture 250 miles to the south. So Great Kivas were first constructed along the Mogollon Rim of east central Arizona in the late 400s AD. They were eventually adopted into the Ancestral Pueblo architectural lexicon during the Basketmaker III period a century later. But they're really rare, especially in the central Mesa Verde. Only 4 Basketmaker III Great Kivas have been excavated in the Ancestral Pueblo world. So 2 of those are along Crow Canyon in northern New Mexico. There's one on the north side of Black Mesa, north of Hopi, and one, the Diederichs site, Great Kiva, is in the central Mesa Verde region in southwest Colorado. So despite the rarity of these structures, there is an incredible consistency, a consistency in size, construction, and use over time of these Great Kivas. And it really implies that there must have been a knowledge of how these special structures should be built and how they should function. And that there was at least a few people across these dispersed populations that actually shared that knowledge. So it's a sign of consistency across a really large region. And that becomes a little bit more important in a minute. So by the late Basketmaker III phase, The culturally diverse Indian Camp Ranch community had grown large. The Great Kiva was kept in use and continued to be a focal point for the community. But those families that had originally lived next to the Great Kiva, they moved away from the Diederichs site. Each one of those pit houses in those northern and southern neighborhoods were ritually burned and closed. The Great Kiva was left alone at the Diederichs site on the Diederichs site ridge. So where did those families go? We believe not very far. There are clusters of households on the higher ridges, both east and west of the Diederichs site. And the people living there were the only members of the whole Indian Camp Ranch community with a clear view of the Diederichs site and the Great Kiva. So when we investigated those households at Ridgeline and Windrow Ruin, they stood out from the rest of the community due to their long occupation, their really large homes, and disproportionate levels of wealth. So these families built oversized pit houses, and those pit houses averaged 8 times the size of standard pit houses in the community. They're extraordinarily large. And they built them directly on top of habitations dating to the earliest settlers in that mid-Basketmaker III phase. So this emphasized their unbroken occupation of these locales for as many as 7 generations. Like the Great Kiva, at least one of the oversized pit houses was remodeled several times, extending its use life to over 75 years. Along with an accumulation of trade goods, cooking vessels, weaving material, ritual faunal, the wealth of these households was also displayed in really large surface room blocks. And these room blocks were so large, they could hold many times the amount of corn needed to feed one extended family for a year. Basically, you can think of these places as having the oldest and wealthiest lineages in the community, and their status appears to have come from their association with and their proximity to the Great Kiva. So these long-standing wealthy lineages may have exercised an element of authority over the land tenure practices in the settlement. Basically, they may have controlled where new immigrants could settle, and they may have done so in an attempt to manage the rapidly expanding Indian Camp Ranch community. A nearest neighbor statistic, which is sort of a GIS statistical model, it was an analysis of the settlements, found that those small settlements, the single pit house Basketmaker III farmsteads, are really evenly dispersed, basically gridded out across good farming soils on the mesa top. These sites are spaced out so there is about 5 acres of farmable land between each homestead in any direction. So when you think about it, the ability to distribute new homesteads in such a pattern and adhere to this practice for generations is evidence that the Indian Camp Ranch community had rules about where people could settle, and they had leaders with authority to enforce those type of rules. So it's really interesting because Kari and the Crow Canyon Laboratory found similar patterns of consistency in the pottery from the Basketmaker Communities Project. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Kari.
Thanks, Shanna. Okay, if it wasn't advancing. So that's great, Shanna, thank you. And as you've just heard from Shanna, we saw major changes in architecture and settlement pattern through the occupation of the Indian Camp Ranch community. And in a similar pattern, ceramic production becomes more systematic as the settlement increases in size. So this slide shows what Basketmaker III pottery looks like in the broader Mesa Verde region. These pots aren't from the BCP though, as we only recovered 4 whole pots from the whole project. But I thought it'd be nice for you to see what the range of pottery vessels look like during this time period. So for the BCP, we recovered and analyzed about 45,000 pottery sherds and 4 whole vessels. We did a number of different types of analyses of the pottery, including general typing of the sherds, as well as more specialized studies of the materials used to make the pots and the designs used to decorate them. I'll first start with the types found on the Basketmaker III period sites in the project area. Okay. So much like other Basketmaker III period sites across the Colorado Plateau, the pottery assemblage from the Indian Camp Ranch settlement is dominated by plain grayware ceramics with smaller amounts of white and brown wares. And as the population grew and the settlement density increased, ceramic production practices became more efficient and systematic. As you can see on this slide, most of the formal types in the pottery assemblage overall are those plain gray wares, but we see a decrease through time in brown wares and an increase through time in white wares. But we want to move beyond just talking about pottery types. We want to look at the potter's choices in making pots to better understand what was going on in the community. So just like Shanna talked about with pit house variation reflecting different communities of practice for architecture, we can also look at communities of practice for pottery making. And a community of practice for pottery making is just the social group in which potters learn to make their vessels. And it means that the variation that we see in pottery assemblages reflect elements of life for the community of potters, such as changes in who's making the pots or new ideas that are coming in from outside of the community. And so what I'd like to now show you is the increasing consistency and efficiency of the pottery production process as seen in 2 elements of pottery making in the community. Well, first, we'll look at the materials selected by the potters, and then we'll look at the designs they choose to decorate their pots. Okay, so to understand the pottery making community of practice, we need to look at the materials potters selected to make the vessels. Clay and temper are the most important materials. And we did a number of studies to better understand both of them. Today, I'm going to talk about just one of those elements, the temper used by the potters, primarily for the sake of time. But we did many, many, many other studies, so please feel free to ask about them in the question and answer session because I'd like to talk about them. But we wanted to highlight just one that could help us tell this story the best. And so temper is just the material that potters add to their clay to make a stronger or better pot. And what you can see in this pie chart is that there's 2 main different types of materials Indian Camp Ranch community potters used for temper. Mixed lithic sand and crushed igneous rock. And both of these are locally available and both make pretty reasonably good pots. And so when we initially began to look at this data, our interpretation said, oh, well, there must be 2 different communities of practice present in the community. But if we look at the temper data by temporal phase, then we see a different pattern. So as you can see from this chart, there is a shift in the practice from the use of primarily sand-tempered pottery to primarily crushed igneous rock-tempered pottery over time. And this is actually really cool because this shift is similar to those documented in other areas of the broader northern Southwest, including the La Plata and the southern Chusca valleys. And this trend continues as potters increasingly utilized crushed igneous rock temper later in the Pueblo I and Pueblo II periods in the central Mesa Verde Valley, or central Mesa Verde region. So, okay, now let's look at what they're doing with designs. Pottery designs are going to reflect highly visible elements of the pottery production process, which is pretty different than looking at temper. You probably couldn't really see the temper that a potter was using by just looking at their pot. You would need to see how they put what materials they mix together. But designs can be copied from the pots themselves, and that means that they're reflecting not only communities of practice within one community, but may reflect broader shared identity. And in previous research, archaeologist Linda Honeycutt has already done some work on designs in the Basketmaker III period, and she identified 9 design motifs utilized across the entire sort of San Juan region, Four Corners region, on Basketmaker III pots based on a sample of about 1,500 black and white bowls and bowl sherds from about almost 80 sites. So we built on Honeycutt's research by analyzing the designs found on BCP pottery. And of the about 1,100 painted sherds from the project, about 400 of them are painted with at least one of Honeycutt's identified design motifs. Most of the other painted sherds just had like a line along the rim, not some different design motif, right? If there was a design motif that you could identify, it basically fit into these categories. And so what that tells us is that across Indian Camp Ranch, all of the folks are communicating enough to share this one kind of design, these design motifs. And if we look at if the design changes over time, we see that all the same design motifs are used for the entire occupation of the community. All design motifs were used in both the middle and late Basketmaker III phases. We only had 2 sherds with design motifs for the early period, so I'm not including it here because, well, as Shanna told you, we didn't have even a whole household represented in the early period. But what these data suggest is that there are no temporal trends in the use of different designs, indicating that the Basketmaker Communities Project study area reflects a single community of practice for design execution. So in conclusion, focused on our pottery data, we see that the design data has no change over time, and the temper data with the change from sand to crushed igneous rock suggests that the pottery production community of practice is really fully integrated by the end of the Basketmaker III period. And in addition, the similarities in designs seen in the study area connects the Indian Camp Ranch community with a really pan-regional Basketmaker III identity. And this parallels the community's dedication to Great Kiva ritual, which were also part of that pan-Basketmaker III regional tradition. So in conclusion, the central Mesa Verde region was a new frontier for farmers in the 7th and 8th centuries AD. Ancestral Pueblo farmers who established settlements in the Indian Camp Ranch community integrated culturally diverse immigrants into a cohesive and stable community that we can see through changes in both architecture and pottery. The settlers brought with them production practices from various traditions across the whole Southwest. And then for the Indian Camp Ranch settlement to overcome individual household risk and inter-household competition in this new frontier, social integration was really imperative. Public gatherings at the Diederichs site Great Kiva served this purpose of integration for over a century. As the community grew, the descendants of the original settlers found themselves with control of the Great Kiva and, an extension, land tenure and production practices across the community. And this development seems to have contributed to the community's economic viability and stability. And these developments were really important to Ancestral Pueblo history. As Crow Canyon research has shown in other projects that focus on the more recent periods of Pueblo 1, 2, and 3, we see that Great Kivas become iconic, integrative spaces for Ancestral Pueblo people. And that the management of these spaces and of the communities they create often falls to a deeply invested and possibly related segment of the population. And so Crow Canyon's focus on communities for the last 40 years that has primarily emphasized Pueblo 2 and Pueblo 3 community centers and social organization. The Basketmaker Communities Project expands that temporal story of the Mesa Verde region with explorations of community development and social organization going back to the very first farmers who initially settled the region by the 7th century AD. And we want to close by saying, if you're interested in reading more about the Basketmaker Communities Project, you can find the final project report and database on Crow Canyon's website. And of course, in the new book, Research, Education, and American Indian Partnerships at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center that just came out. Thank you very much, and we look forward to answering many of your questions. And a shout out to Jane Dillard, who I think is watching this now.
Yes, she is. Thank you, Jane. And thank you, Kari and Shanna. Just spectacular. Well, we have a lot of questions, and I think I'll start with the one who put it in the chat instead of in the Q&A, because it just popped up. So I'm gonna jump in there. And the question is, Julie Lowell ties Mogollon Great Kivas to dual organization moieties within communities in that region and elsewhere. Is there evidence of this dual organization at Indian Camp Ranch during the Basketmaker III period?
I'll take that. If we went back to the Dillard site, so this, when you're talking moiety organization or dual organization in at site settlements, people have talked about that all the way back into the Pueblo I period, so the 800s. We're really pushing it back into the 600s if we start talking about that at the Dillard site. But I would argue that we've got some sort of dual division going on with that group of pit houses to the south and that group of pit houses to the north, possibly representing a moiety division. The other interesting thing about that is that each one of those pit house clusters was fenced in by what we would call a stockade, but it's more of a small sort of settlement definition fence around each of those neighborhoods. So we even have structural evidence that they sort of contain themselves in different ways. So yeah, north and south, a pretty interesting dynamic. Hard to say that it's clearly moiety like we see in late Pueblo architecture, but I think it's there.
Great, thanks, Shanna. In case you were wondering, I just clicked on that. It was Mike Adler asking that question. Thank you.
Hi, Mike.
I'm going to jump to a question from the Q&A from a friend and colleague, Ron Martinez Looking Elk, who says, great presentation. Since you included a cultural advisory role aspect to your research, what new or further information did you learn about this cultural group of farmers?
You want me to take that, Shanna? I mean, I think one example, thank you for that question. That's a great question. We worked really closely with the Native Advisory Group, and my side, I'm going to talk about the pottery because, that's my favorite thing to talk about, is that I had such wonderful conversations about and showed the pottery to all of the, especially there were a lot of potters in the group at that time. I think, especially Marie Reyna, who's recently passed, Tessie Naranjo, Rose Wieko, a number of the folks that were potters were really interested in seeing this very early Pueblo pottery and looking at sort of the experimentation phase that we saw as new communities were moving into this relatively empty area, and certainly an empty area where they hadn't been making any pottery. And so they really came up with many of the ideas that we've talked about of this experimentation and diversity of different populations coming together and then kind of figuring out what the best recipe was and using that recipe, which is a recipe that we see potters in the region using for hundreds of years after these sort of pioneering potters figured out that recipe and figured out what the best materials were in the Mesa Verde region to make pots. So that's one sort of narrow example. I don't know, Shanna, if you have any others that you'd like to add.
I would say, it was along the same line. The diversity, I think, was really important to people talking to the advisory group, thinking about where people were coming from and how big of an area they were representing. So, one thing we didn't talk about was that we found little barley. So Karen Adams, who is the archaeobotanic analyst, found little barley, which is actually a domesticate that grows down in the Hohokam area. So, people, we tend to think that people are in these very small zones and that they're very territorial about them. But, a big point that I'm always trying to make is that, the Basketmaker III period had so much movement, so much cohesive, and it was one of the most peaceful times in Pueblo history that we can see. So I think that was really interesting to our advisory group, is the diversity and how they were able through social systems to create fairly stable and peaceful communities.
Fantastic. Thank you both. The questions are pouring in. I'm going to try to do a little bit of grouping, and I'm going to group kind of an architectural question from our friend John Cater about the Great Kiva. A few questions around what were the dimensions? Was it roofed? Do you have evidence of closure? Is it different from the larger pit house as defined by Brew in the Pueblo I period?
Okay, wow. Okay. John, good to hear from you. Yeah, absolutely. This Great Kiva was roofed. What you're looking at in those photos is the architectural stone that was around the edge of the roof that probably maybe vertically raised the roof a little bit. And then we had a major roof huge timbers that came into the interior, 4-post support system, and very circular. We had a nice bench around the edge, and then the internal features tell us also that it's related to not only earlier Great Kivas from the Mogollon region, but that it is the template for later Great Kivas like you see in Chaco or the Pueblo III period. So, I've had this debate lots because there's been, especially archaeologists in particular, we've been mishmashing large pit houses and Great Kivas together for a long time. But this structure is very different, both in its form and in the way it was used. So it's about 20 meters in diameter, and it is not a house. It did not have a fire pit. It had, Kari, do you want to go to maybe one of the floors? It did have what we call floor vaults. Yeah, it's probably way at the bottom. What you're looking at on this slide is the closure, and John mentioned that too. So at the very end of the occupation, all of those bowls that Kari was talking about were smashed and spread across a layer of sand that was almost 10 centimeters thick, and it was like a green sand that they collected from a water alluvial place. And we had lots of pollens from sort of wetlands. So yeah, just there was a lot of what I would call symbolic information embedded in that Great Kiva. So that's just a very different thing. When we look at those oversized pit houses, they are houses. They've got, corn storage and milling equipment and roasting and cooking hearths inside of them. But this is a absolutely just different kind of structure altogether. Hope that sort of covered it. There could be a whole talk just on the Great Kiva. That should be Kari and I's next discussion.
I will definitely broadcast from the Great Kiva.
And the Great Kiva, it's got a lab story as well. And we had a bunch of enterprising volunteers and interns and staff that spent an entire winter looking at this Great Kiva third floor, because there were these intentional pots that were broken intentionally and spread throughout the entire floor, which was many, many different excavation units, and trying to reconstruct these vessels, which, we did an okay job, but I'm sure the rest of the vessels might be there, but maybe they're under that not excavated corner. So, this is an important place, and it was an important ceremony at the closure of this at the structure, and gave us our 2 of our 4 reconstructible pots for the whole project. Came from the Great Kiva.
Well, on the subject of pots, I'm going to group a couple of pottery questions for Kari, so Shanna could breathe for a minute. One technical question: did you use neutron activation analysis on any of the pottery? And then a little bit more of a general question: would the different motifs on the pottery represent the specific uses of the pot as a form of communication and continuity between new and mixed migrants?
Sure. I'll first do the neutron activation because I have that slide all ready to go. I should. We did do neutron activation analysis, which basically, instead of looking at just the temper, that allows you to look at both the clay and the temper compositionally. And although this is a little bit messy, what you see are kind of 3 circles or ellipses that overlap quite a bit, but those 3 circles are the temper groups. And so what this is telling you is that temper is just as good of a way of looking at the composition than neutron activation. So we ended up not using that quite as much as looking at the temper. So the temper story was a little bit clearer. How about that? As opposed to neutron activation. So, and then for the designs, let's go back to the designs. We actually did look at if different designs were used at different communities across both the project area, and then we did some looking at some other sites that had big Basketmaker III assemblages. And we really did not find that specific motifs were used in specific places, which what that says is that everybody's using kind of the same suite of motifs. Does that answer that question? I think it does. Okay.
I think so. We don't have a follow-up yet.
Okay.
Well, I'm just going to jump in because there was a motifs question in here about do the design motifs show basket designs?
You know, I think many of the designs certainly look very basket-like, you know, especially these ones here, you know, there's definitely elements that are very basket-like. I would say a lot of the Pueblo pottery, even coming into more contemporary designs, still carry some of the design motifs that you see on baskets. But I would say many of these designs could probably have come from designs that artists were already using on baskets.
Great, excellent. Well, okay, so I'm staying with pottery to try to knock some of these out. And a question, were there any self-tempered clays?
There were some that we think just had some naturally occurring sand, and also this little thing that we called clay pellets, or kind of like shaly bits that seem to have been part of the original clay that hadn't totally decomposed, right? So there was definitely some clays that probably folks were collecting that already had those inclusions in them, but definitely, especially the igneous rock that becomes the pattern later on, would have needed to be added, probably wouldn't already have come in the clay. And probably that's the igneous rock does make slightly better pot. Like it's a little bit better, especially because if you're using sand and depending on where you pick your sand up from, if it has a bunch of calcium carbonate in it, it's going to make your pot explode later or disintegrate later. So it's not ideal. So the igneous rock really makes a good sturdy, especially a good cooking pot.
Fantastic. And wrapping up some of the more technical pottery questions, someone is wondering, I think probably from the images of the reconstructible pots, how can you tell that the pots were purposefully broken?
Well, I think especially for the ones on the floor of the Great Kiva is that they were spread over one floor surface, like all the way to the edges of the Great Kiva. So it's not, you know, typically you do find pots that are broken and unintentionally, and you might find all the pieces together, but you would find all the pieces together. These ones were completely spread over the course of that nice sand layer that Shanna was mentioning for that sort of last layer of use on the floor of the Great Kiva.
All right, we're going to take you off the hot seat, Dr. Schleher, and we're going to ask some more complicated questions of poor Shanna here. A couple of them that could be related, and they're more around kind of community and social organization. We have a common question around, do you see evidence of social stratification or elites? And then another question that you might want to comment on at the same time around your comment that these were some of the more peaceful communities, and how do researchers evaluate and determine and hypothesize about the peacefulness of a community?
I should give that one back to you, Liz, but
I'm just the moderator today, anyway.
There has been several studies, and the ones that I'm thinking of were before the Basketmaker Communities project actually happened, but comparing evidence for violence in populations. So do we have any human remains with evidence of violence? Also just imagery of warfare, maybe even any kind of weaponry, that kind of thing that's going on. And what is surprising is over and over in several different studies, what we see is just a dearth of information of evidence for violence in the Basketmaker III period. And we don't think that that's because we haven't looked enough. There's been lots of Basketmaker III sites that have been analyzed and excavated, as a comparison, but we just don't see, like before this, during the Basketmaker II phase, there is quite a bit of very pointed, probably band on band level violence. And then there's other evidence later on in time. So we just don't have that happening in Basketmaker III. And that's one of the questions is, well, how did they get to that point? Maybe you can't hold on to that level of social integration or community leveling or territorial jostling. We really expected that there would be much more competition in a brand new open frontier. So this wave of colonization that happened in the central Mesa Verde area is very different than when the West was settled in historic times, which was really marked by a lot of violence. This was not, and it's fairly surprising for that fact. And then you were talking, what was the other part of the question, Liz? Sorry.
Well, it's sort of about, it was kind of social stratification and inequality and peacefulness.
Yeah, so social stratification, and that's what we were getting at with these oversized pit houses, in those households, those middens, literally we saw that there was, that those families had more. They had more of everything, whether that was pottery or weaving material or raw clays, storage features, whatever that was, they had more of it. But, I don't want to call it stratification, because I think that there is an element that we miss sometimes, and that is people that have more responsibility is what that might look like, whether they are distributing food and materials to other people, or they were responsible for certain places. But there is it is very distinct between those small farmsteads that are out there and those really large households. You get quite a dichotomy.
Wonderful, thank you. We'll pivot a bit from talking about pottery. One of our participants are wondering, can you talk a little bit about any other artifacts found in the study area besides pottery?
Sure, of course. And a big shout out to Kate Hughes, who was also a co-author on this chapter with Shanna and I, who did all of the work with the lithic materials, the chipstone materials for the project. And she really documented that there were a good amount of non-local stone tool materials that were coming, we had obsidian coming in from a number of different locations because we were able to do compositional work on that, non-destructive compositional work on the obsidian. And I think we had some really exotic locations. There was definitely the normal places that we see Pueblo folks trading with in the Jemez Mountains and also Mount Taylor. But there was also an interesting, I think one place over in far western Utah called White Horse. Kate's on here. Maybe she'll tell me. And so that was pretty interesting because that wasn't actually a source that we saw being used very much later in time. Like, it's pretty rare. So that would, again, that goes to this this argument that Shanna and I are talking about for the community, that it had really diverse origins. There was jewelry. There was a lot of lovely bone tools. There was this beautiful piece of turquoise that, I mean, was like, a silver dollar size piece of turquoise that wasn't made into an ornament. So we don't know if it was more ceremonial versus something that was worn as jewelry. But we had lots of things like weaving tools. And Shanna, you obviously want to say something else, and go say whatever other than you're remembering.
You were talking about minerals, and one of the most interesting things that we found was raw galena. So that's raw lead, and raw galena, Kari can talk to this more, but raw lead can't travel very far. It is so heavy, it doesn't travel down waterways. So it's not something you're going to collect from, a riverbed. You literally have to go to the source of, a lead deposit. So and lead is really important later on in pottery and other things, but it was really exciting to find them collecting all of these really interesting minerals.
Right, and that mineral, that we sourced that piece of lead, and sort of, we did some analysis by a graduate student, and now I can't remember her name, Brunella Straticelli or something like that, I'm sorry. What?
Thibodeau.
No, Brunella is the one who did the galena. Allison did the azurite, which I'll talk about in 1 second. But the galena rock that we actually sourced, we did not source it to where it came from. Like, we weren't able to figure out where in the landscape it came from, but it matched another piece of galena that was found in Pueblo Bonito, at Chaco Canyon, much, probably later in time. And so that's really interesting because it means that the Dillard residents and folks living at Pueblo Bonito were using the same source, somehow got this same source material of the galena. And then we also did the same thing with azurite, which was an interesting thing. We did some sourcing of azurite that we found at the Dillard site, especially these little blue azurite nodules. And so most of the sources seem to be from Southeast Utah, kind of the Lisbon Valley area of Southeast Utah. So the residents in this community just had connections all over the place. And some of those were similar to what we see more recently in Pueblo history. And then some were a little bit different, like that one piece of obsidian that was coming from farther west than normal.
Fantastic. All right, I think we have time for one more, and I think we're not getting to all of them, but I think we've touched on many of the topics as well. And you can email crowcanyon.org, and we will pass on your questions if necessary. But this seems like a good one to close on, and a topic around what happens after Basketmaker III in this area, which I chat with my buddy Jim Potter and Steve Copeland about quite a bit. But the question is, where did people go? What happened when the occupation of this site ceased?
Well, I can talk to you, I can tell the story of sort of the end of what it looks like, the Basketmaker III phase, this first flourish of everybody showing up. occupying the Dillard site, building a great kiva, keeping it active for 100 years, building these huge oversized pit houses directly next to it. And then finally, right around 720, it looks like they decided to close that great kiva. They, as Kari was saying, they break down the pottery, spread it around. There's also all sorts of other artifacts, including archaic points, projectile points put on the bench surfaces, and then they burn that structure down. A lot of the oversized pit houses are closed around that same time. And that dispersed population, we have some what we would call Pueblo One sites, so into the 700s, 800s, that are on Indian Camp Ranch, but there's far fewer. But I do know that there is at least one large Pueblo One site, maybe two of them on the property. So what I see is that people stop having this sort of dispersed farming, and they start aggregating into bigger groups in particular. The one thing that they really let go is that great kiva in particular. So that social integration piece for a larger community goes away at that time.
Kari, did you have anything to add, or?
That's a great, perfect answer.
That really was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you so much, Shanna. And we're right at 5:01, and we do try to be respectful of everyone's time. So thank you. There's nothing but compliments in the chat and the Q&A. So take a quick scroll through those. Thank you so much to all of our viewers. You had a record turnout, and Kari, we're going to see you next week. Is that right?
Yes, I'm excited. I will be there.
Right. And Shanna, we know where you live, so.
Great. I'm sending a representative. He's just a lot bigger shoulders than I have. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've seen him already. All right. Take care, my friends, and have a wonderful evening.
All right. You too.
Thanks,
Thank you, Liz.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.